Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Tonight we go back to the year 793 and take a look at life as a Viking. So sit back, relax and turn the lights off. Get cozy under a blanket and let's travel back in time. If you enjoy this video, please give it a like and subscribe. The year is 793. Europe is a patchwork quilt of kingdoms, tribes and monasteries, all stitched together with faith and fear. Rome has long since fallen, but its shadow still lingers like the aftertaste of a strong wine. Charlemagne rules a mighty empire on the continent, busy crowning himself with glory and converting pagans with sword and sermon. Meanwhile, across the North Sea, in a quiet corner of England, the monks of Lindisfarne start their day with prayers, not knowing history is about to barge in like an uninvited dinner guest. Let's zoom in on England. Back then it wasn't one united country, but a messy chessboard of kingdoms. Northumbria, sitting in the northeast, was one of the heavy hitters. It had a proud history of kings and battles, but its real bragging rights came from its holy island, Lindisfarne. Think of it as a mix between the Vatican and a countryside retreat. Pilgrims flocked there. Kings and nobles sent gifts. The place was famous for turning out saints and scholars, not warriors. Lindisfarne wasn't big or flashy. It was a small tidal island, cut off from the mainland twice a day by the sea. But what it lacked in size, it made up for in spirit. Here, the monks lived simple lives, rising before dawn, chanting prayers, copying manuscripts by hand, and occasionally debating whether fasting really meant no cheese or just less cheese. Their goal was to get closer to God, and in their minds, they were doing pretty well at it. Life in Northumbria could be rough. This wasn't exactly an age of comfort. No Wi-Fi, no running water, not even reliable heating unless you count huddling around smoky fires. But monasteries were oases. They stored grain, gave shelter to travellers, healed the sick and offered education. In fact, monasteries were pretty much the medieval version of universities, hospitals, libraries and Starbucks combined. If you wanted knowledge or refuge, this was the place to go. One of Lindisfarne's crown jewels was its famous manuscript, the Lindisfarne Gospels. Imagine the Bible, but every page decorated with swirling Celtic knots, jewel-coloured patterns and golden ink. It was the kind of book that made you forget the aching hand cramps it must have taken to write. The monks believed creating such beauty was an act of worship itself. In a world where most people couldn't even sign their names, these monks were turning parchment into works of art. So picture this scene: the monastery bells ring, the air smells of salt from the sea, and the chants of the monks float through the stone halls. Outside, sheep graze on the windy hills, fishermen mend their nets, and pilgrims arrive by boat, eager to step onto the holy island. It's calm, almost sleepy, like time itself moves slower here. That's the world of Lindisfarne in 793, a fragile bubble of peace, unaware of the storm already brewing across the sea. But this wasn't just a quiet island retreat. It carried huge spiritual weight. Lindisfarne was where Christianity had taken root in northern England. St. Aidan had founded the monastery back in the 7th century, and it became a powerhouse of faith. For the Anglo-Saxons, Lindisfarne wasn't just holy, it was the holy spot. To attack it would be like raiding the National Cathedral, the Library of Congress, and a university all at once. And here's the thing, monasteries weren't fortresses. They weren't designed for defence. The monks probably had a few wooden fences and maybe a rusty spear lying around, but no real protection. Their strongest weapon was prayer. In a peaceful world, that was enough. But the world was changing, and soon that holy bubble was about to pop in the most brutal way imaginable. To understand why Lindisfarne mattered so much, you've got to remember how central faith was back then. The church wasn't just about religion, it was politics, wealth and identity all rolled into one. A monastery like Lindisfarne wasn't just a house of God, it was a bank, a school, a hospital and a museum. And just like any bank or museum, it had treasures worth taking. Gold chalices, jewelled crosses, and ornate manuscripts made it a beacon to the faithful, and to anyone with sticky fingers. So there it was, Northumbria at the height of its power, Lindisfarne shining as its jewel, monks living quiet and faithful lives, all under the impression that God's protection was enough. It seemed like a safe and sacred world. But history has a sense of drama. Just when life feels the most peaceful, that's when it throws in a plot twist. And in 793, that twist was waiting on the horizon, carried on the dragon-headed prows of Viking ships. If you want to understand why Lindisfarne got hit, you've got to sail north. Way north. Past the green fields of England, across the cold grey waves of the North Sea, lies a land of mountains, fjords and forests. This is Scandinavia in the late 8th century, the home of the Norsemen. Back then, nobody called them Vikings. They were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen and traders. The word Viking was more like a job title, a temporary career. To go a Viking simply meant to go raiding overseas, kind of like how modern students go abroad for a semester, except with more axes and fewer study credits. Life in Scandinavia wasn't all mead and feasting. The land was beautiful, yes, but also tough. The soil was thin and rocky, winters were long and dark, and the growing season was short. People scraped what they could from farming barley, rye and oats. Cows and sheep dotted the pastures, while hardy fishermen pulled cod and herring from the sea. It was a hard life, but it built hard people. You didn't survive by being soft. You survived by being clever, strong and always ready for what the world threw at you. The Norse weren't just farmers, though. They were explorers at heart. Living on a jagged coastline meant the sea was always whispering in their ears. From the time they were kids, they learned how to row, how to fish, and how to read the weather by watching the clouds roll in. A Viking boy might not know how to write his name, but he could tell you which way the wind was shifting just by how the gulls flew. The ocean wasn't a barrier. It was a highway. And of course, no story of the Norse is complete without their gods. Odin, the one-eyed wanderer who traded a knife for wisdom. Thor with his hammer Mjolnir, protector of men and gods alike. Freyja, goddess of love and war. Loki, the trickster who always had a scheme up his sleeve. Their mythology wasn't just stories told around the fire, it was a world view. Thunder wasn't weather, it was Thor throwing his hammer. The northern lights weren't just pretty, they were reflections of Valkyrie riding across the sky. In a world full of uncertainty, these myths gave meaning to the chaos. But here's the twist. Even with their gods and their bravery, the Norse still had to deal with reality. Land in Scandinavia was limited. Families grew, villages expanded, and soon there just wasn't enough fertile soil to go round. The younger sons often got the short end of the stick. No farm, no inheritance, no prospects. So what do you do if you're a strong young man with no land and too much energy? You build a ship, you grab some friends, and you go find your fortune somewhere else. That's where the legendary longship comes in. These weren't clumsy boats. They were sleek, shallow-draft vessels that could handle the crashing waves of the open sea, but also slide up shallow rivers like arrows through water. With a carved dragon head at the prow and rows of strong arms pulling oars, they were fast, frightening and flexible. A fleet of longships could appear out of nowhere, strike hard and vanish before the local lord even managed to saddle his horse. It was the medieval version of a surprise air raid. Now don't think of the Norse as just axe-swinging raiders. They were also savvy traders. Long before Lindisfarne, Norse merchants were already sailing to places like Frisia, trading furs, amber and walrus ivory for silver, wine and fancy glassware. The same people who could raid your coast one summer might come back the next as businessmen, haggling in the market. It was a blurred line, friend one year, enemy the next. Depends on the mood, the season, and how much silver you were carrying. But when push came to shove, raiding paid faster than trading. A monastery was a tempting target, rich, poorly defended, and stuffed with treasures. The Norse might not have cared about the religious meaning of golden chalices and jewelled crosses, but they knew wealth when they saw it. And with a good ship, a strong crew, and the element of surprise, you could make in one raid what might take years of honest farming. Scandinavian society itself encouraged this spirit of adventure. At the feasts, skalds sang songs of daring raids, great voyages, and warriors who carved their names into the world with sword and sail. Honour mattered more than safety. A man's reputation lived longer than his body. Better to die young and famous than old and forgotten. With that mindset, is it any wonder so many young men chose the sea? By the time 793 rolled around, the Norse were already testing the waters. They had raided parts of Ireland, dabbled in coastal hit-and-runs in Frisia, and were eyeing Britain's eastern shores. They knew monasteries were soft targets. They knew the seas better than anyone else, and they had the hunger, for wealth, for glory, for land. Lindisfarne was just the first name on a very long list. Every great story of the Vikings begins with their ships. Forget the swords, the helmets, no, they didn't have horns, and even the sagas. The real stars of the Viking Age were the longships. Without them, the raids, the trading routes, the discoveries, none of it would have happened. These ships were more than wooden sail. They were passports to the world, floating homes, and weapons all in one. The genius of the longship was in its design. It was long and narrow with a shallow draft. That meant it could slice across the open ocean and creep up shallow rivers without getting stuck. Imagine a boat that could handle both the North Sea's rolling waves and a backwater stream in the English countryside. That's like owning an SUV that also works as a jet ski. No wonder everyone feared them. The construction was an art in itself. Planks overlapped each other like fish scales, a method called clinker building. This made the ship strong yet flexible, able to bend with the waves instead of snapping against them. Picture a wooden snake slithering over the water, except the snake is full of warriors who really want your silver. And then there was the decoration. Vikings weren't plain about their ships. They carved dragon heads or serpents onto the prows, fierce wooden faces staring down the sea. Were they meant to scare off spirits, or just to look terrifying when you spotted them coming over the horizon? Probably both. Imagine you're a monk in Lindisfarne, sipping your morning ale. When you glance up and see 10 snarling dragon heads sliding toward shore, breakfast ruined. The sails were just as important. Made from wool and dyed with stripes or bold colours, they turned the longship from a rowboat into a sea rocket. A strong crew could row all day, but with a good wind in the sail they could cover 150 miles in a single day. That kind of speed was unheard of. Armies could march maybe 20 miles on a good day. The longship turned the Norse into the medieval world's first rapid response team. But these weren't just warships. They doubled as transport, cargo carriers, and even floating homes. Warriors slept on deck under the stars or beneath a tent of sailcloth. Their belongings were packed in sea chests, which doubled as benches for rowing. Every bit of space was used. Vikings weren't packing suitcases. They were packing shields, spears, and maybe a goat if they needed milk on the trip. It wasn't just the boats, it was the people steering them. Viking sailors didn't have compasses. Instead, they read the sun, the stars, and the flight of seabirds. Some say they used sunstones, crystals that revealed the sun's direction even on cloudy days. Whether that's myth or truth, one thing's clear. They were masters of navigation. To modernise, it's insane, crossing the North Sea in an open boat. But for them, it was Tuesday. And when they arrived, they didn't just arrive quietly. A fleet of longships hitting your coast was like thunder on water. The rhythmic slap of oars, the crash of hulls on sand, the sudden shouts of men leaping ashore. It was designed to terrify. No walls were high enough, no church doors thick enough once the dragon ships landed. The longship didn't just move men across water, it projected fear long before the first axe was raised. But here's the funny thing, not all longship journeys ended in violence. Many were about trade, exploration, even diplomacy. These same ships that brought terror to Lindisfarne also carried settlers to Iceland, explorers to Greenland, and eventually Leif Erikson all the way to North America. Imagine sitting in Newfoundland in the year 1000, watching a dragon ship appear out of the fog. Surprise! The Vikings made it before Columbus even sharpened a quill. So when we say sea kings, that's not just poetry. These ships gave the Norse the power to rule wherever the waves could take them. A farmer's son could become a raider, a trader, or even a king if he commanded a number of ships. The longship was the beating heart of Viking expansion, the floating bridge between poverty at home and opportunity abroad. Without it, Lindisfarne would have remained a quiet monastery, untouched and unknown. With it, history was about to change forever. Before the raid, Lindisfarne wasn't just some remote rock in the sea. It was the Holy Island, a lighthouse of faith shining out over the cold waters of Northumbria. Founded in the 7th century by St. Aidan, the place quickly grew into a powerhouse of religion and learning. Think of it as part monastery, part university, and part miracle factory. Kings and nobles showered it with gifts, and pilgrims crossed stormy waters just to walk on its sands. St. Aidan, the founder, wasn't flashy. He was humble, patient, and known for walking from village to village instead of riding on horseback, because he wanted to meet people eye to eye. From this quiet little island base, Christianity spread across northern England. And when he passed on, other holy men followed, most famously St. Cuthbert, whose reputation for miracles made Lindisfarne a magnet for pilgrims. If Aidan lit the torch, Cuthbert kept it burning. By the late 8th century, Lindisfarne wasn't just another monastery. It was a spiritual brand name. Kings visited, nobles donated, and even foreign dignitaries heard of it. To step foot on Lindisfarne was to feel closer to heaven, and in a time when plagues, famine and war were never far away, people needed that closeness. The island became a holy anchor in a stormy world. The jewel in Lindisfarne's crown was its manuscript, the Lindisfarne Gospels. Written and decorated around 700 AD, it's one of the most breathtaking books ever made. Imagine pages alive with colour, swirling Celtic knots, fierce birds, curling vines, all painted by hand in glowing reds, blues and golds. The book wasn't just scripture, it was a visual hymn. Today it sits behind glass in a museum, but back then it was a holy relic, proof that art itself could be prayer. But the monks didn't spend all day painting or chanting. Life was a rhythm of prayer, work and survival. They farmed sheep on the windy hills, gathered shellfish from the shore, and brewed ale. Yes, monks were excellent brewers. They copied manuscripts, healed the sick, and gave shelter to travellers. For many locals, the monastery wasn't just a holy site. It was a lifeline. If you had walked into the monastery on an ordinary morning, you'd hear chanting echoing off the stone walls, see candles flickering over carved wooden altars, and smell a mix of incense and damp wool robes. The monks' voices would rise in harmony, praising God, their lives measured not by hours but by prayers. Outside, pilgrims waited with offerings, hoping to touch a relic or receive a blessing. The place radiated a sense of peace, almost untouchable. That's why Lindisfarne was so symbolic. To the Anglo-Saxons, it wasn't just holy, it was untouchable. The island's tides cut it off twice a day, like nature itself was guarding it. And who would dare attack a place like this? Who would raise a hand against God's servants? The thought seemed absurd, but as history shows, what feels safest is often most vulnerable. For Northumbria, Lindisfarne was a source of pride. Kings boasted of their connections to it. Nobles wanted to be buried near its saints. Pilgrims carried its stories back to their villages. If Christianity in England had a northern capital, this was it, which is exactly why when disaster struck it hit with the force of a thunderclap. And here's a small but crucial detail. Lindisfarne wasn't built like a fortress. Its walls were meant to keep out the wind, not an army. The monks had faith, not fortifications. They believed the tides and God's hand would protect them. But to seafaring warriors with shallow ships and sharp blades, tides weren't a barrier. They were an invitation. So when we call Lindisfarne the Jewel of the North, it wasn't just about wealth or beauty. It was about meaning. It was about faith shining against the darkness of the age. And when the Vikings came crashing down on it, they weren't just plundering treasure, they were shattering a symbol. What followed turned the jewel into a scar, one that still marks the history of England today. By the late 8th century, the waters between Scandinavia and Britain weren't empty highways. They were buzzing with traffic. Traders, fishermen and the occasional raider crossed the North Sea like commuters on a Monday morning, except these commuters carried swords and had no sense of rush hour. Lindisfarne might have felt safe and remote, but across the waves, rumours were swirling of strange northern men testing their luck on foreign shores. Let's start with the Frisians, those merchants on the coast of modern-day Netherlands and Germany. They had already had some uncomfortable encounters with the Norse. Traders told stories of ships sliding out of the mist, men with axes demanding silver instead of politely negotiating over it. Sometimes trade fairs turned bloody. Word of these sea wolves spread faster than an alehouse rumour. And rumours, of course, travel farther than ships. Ireland too had tasted the Norse bite. Coastal monasteries found themselves visited by uninvited guests, and not the pilgrim kind. Fires were lit, treasures taken, monks scattered. These weren't full-scale invasions yet, more like test runs, but even small raids left scars. The Irish scribes wrote in their chronicles about sudden attacks from the sea, painting the raiders as shadows that appeared and vanished before anyone could respond. Meanwhile, in England, the kingdoms weren't exactly united. Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and a handful of smaller states all jockeyed for power, like siblings fighting over the last piece of bread. Internal squabbles meant defences were patchy. Kings were more worried about their rivals inland than about ghostly raiders overseas. That left monasteries exposed like unlocked treasure chests. And let's not forget the weather. For the Norse, summer meant sailing season. When the seas calmed, their longships could skim across the water like blades. England's coastline, dotted with monasteries, villages, and market towns, looked like a buffet waiting to be sampled. Lindisfarne, sitting pretty just off the Northumbrian coast, might as well have had a glowing easy target sign hanging over it. Still, the Anglo-Saxons weren't completely clueless. They had heard whispers of raids, monks and travellers carried tales from Ireland and the continent. But when a story has to hop from one campfire to another across hundreds of miles, it often sounds more like legend than warning. By the time news of real raids reached Northumbria, the sea was already carrying the next fleet toward them. It didn't help that Northumbria itself was shaky. The kingdom had enjoyed golden days under earlier rulers, but by 793 it was plagued with infighting, assassinations and political drama worthy of a soap opera. Kings didn't last long. Nobles stabbed each other in the back, sometimes literally. In times of chaos, who had the time to think about coastal defence? Certainly not the monks of Lindisfarne, who trusted God more than soldiers. Meanwhile, the Norse were listening. Traders who travelled between Scandinavia and England carried more than goods. They carried gossip. They knew which coasts were rich, which monasteries glittered with treasure, and which kingdoms were too busy fighting themselves to respond quickly. If raiding was a business, the Norse had excellent market research. And all reports pointed to Lindisfarne as a ripe opportunity. From the English perspective, there were signs of something coming. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records immense whirlwinds, flashes of lightning and fiery dragons in the sky before the Lindisfarne raid. To us that sounds like a mix of bad weather and vivid imagination, but to people then it was divine warning. Nature itself seemed to be groaning that a storm, not of clouds but of men, was about to break. So you had the perfect setup. On one side of the sea, restless Norse warriors eager for silver and glory. On the other side, a kingdom distracted and a monastery glittering like an unlocked vault. The sea was no barrier, it was a bridge, and in the summer of 793, the bridge was about to be crossed. Picture it. The summer sun rising over the North Sea, the waves rolling calm and gentle, gulls crying overhead. For the monks of Lindisfarne, it probably seemed like any other day. They rose before dawn, shuffled into the chapel, and began chanting prayers in the cool morning air. Some tended sheep on the hillsides, others fished in the shallows, and a few bent over manuscripts, scratching ink across parchment. The tide lapped quietly at the causeway. Peace, routine, stability. The ships were long, lean and fast, dragon-headed prows slicing the water, crews of hard-eyed Norsemen pulling at the oars. These weren't traders here to haggle over furs. They were raiders, their minds fixed on treasure, livestock and slaves. Their ships rode low in the water, heavy with men, but still gliding smooth as knives. To the fishermen of the coast, they must have looked like predators slipping in from the mist. We don't know exactly how the first monk spotted them. Maybe a lookout on the cliff squinted into the haze. Maybe a fisherman froze mid-net, staring at the approaching sails. Maybe a bell rang out, clanging an alarm. What we do know is that the sight of those dragon ships must have sent a chill through every bone. For a monastery built on prayer, not defence, there was no battle plan. There was only fear. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it bluntly. The ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne. Imagine the shock, pagans of all people storming the holiest island of Northumbria. The monks would have clutched their crosses, muttered prayers, and looked desperately to the sea, hoping the tide or divine mercy might save them. Instead, the tide carried the raiders straight to shore. The attack itself must have been swift and brutal. The Vikings were experts at lightning raids. Hit hard, grab what you can, and vanish before an army gathers. They poured into the monastery, axes flashing, shields banging. The monks, unarmed and untrained, had no chance. Some fled across the tidal flats, some tried to hide. Others stood their ground in prayer, but steel doesn't pause for piety. Treasures were ripped from the altar. Golden chalices, jewelled crosses, ornate manuscripts, anything that glittered or could be sold. Livestock was driven onto ships. Survivors were chained and shoved toward the boats, destined for the slave markets of Scandinavia. The raiders weren't interested in theology. To them, this was just good business. For the people of Northumbria, the horror wasn't just in the violence, it was in the symbolism. This wasn't a raid on some nameless farm. This was Lindisfarne, the holy island, the jewel of their faith. To see it burning, to hear monks screaming where prayers once rose, must have felt like the world itself was cracking. The unthinkable had happened. God's island had been violated. Back in Europe, word spread quickly. Alcuin of York, a scholar in Charlemagne's court, wrote with despair, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain." To him, the raid wasn't just an attack on monks. It was an attack on Christendom itself. If the Holy Island could fall, what was safe? The raid was more than theft. It was a message. And yet, for the raiders, this was only the beginning. Lindisfarne wasn't the end of their story. It was the start. One raid proved what longships and courage could achieve. Monasteries and villages across Britain would soon learn that the dragon ships didn't just pass once. They returned again and again, like storms rolling in from the sea. The summer of 793 was the first clap of thunder in what would become the Viking Age. So, on that summer day in 793, history pivoted. For the monks, it was tragedy. For the Anglo-Saxons, it was a divine nightmare. For the Norse, it was opportunity. A quiet island monastery became the spark that lit a new age of exploration, terror, and transformation. The summer of 793 ended with ashes on the shore and ripples spreading across Europe, ripples that still reach us today. When the dragon-headed prows finally scraped against the sand of Lindisfarne, peace shattered like glass. The raiders leapt ashore, their boots sinking into the wet tidal flats. Shields on arms, axes in hands, they stormed the monastery grounds with the speed of wolves breaking into a sheep pen. For the monks, who were still clutching their rosaries, it must have felt like the end of the world had arrived in the form of men from the sea. The first moments of the raid were chaos. Monks scrambled across the fields, tripping over their robes, some trying desperately to ring the bells in warning, others simply frozen in shock. The sound of prayer was replaced by the clash of steel, the pounding of boots, and the shouts of warriors. Lindisfarne, the jewel of the north, was about to be smashed apart in minutes. The raiders knew exactly what they wanted. Monasteries weren't just holy, they were wealthy. The altar glittered with gold and silver. Reliquaries, chalices, and jewelled crosses all went into sacks. Even manuscripts, which to the Vikings looked like glittering treasures rather than books, were grabbed. To a raider, it didn't matter if the page contained scripture or someone's grocery list. If it had gold leaf, it was worth taking. But treasure wasn't the only thing taken. People were, too. Some monks were struck down where they stood. Others were bound in ropes, dragged toward the ships, and shoved aboard as captives. For a Norse raider, a live monk was almost as valuable as a gold chalice. Captives could be ransomed, traded, or sold into slavery across Scandinavia. To the monks, it was unthinkable. To the raiders, it was as profit. The violence was shocking, not because it was rare, but because of where it happened. This wasn't a battlefield or a castle. It was a sacred island where the holiest men of Northumbria had lived and prayed. To see its walls torn down, its relics scattered, and its people slaughtered felt like an insult hurled straight at God. That made the raid unforgettable, carved into memory with fire and blood. One account says blood ran through the church like water. Another describes monks cut down at the altar. Whether every detail is literal or exaggerated, the impact was the same. Sheer horror. To the survivors, it wasn't just physical destruction, it was spiritual terror. The pagans had broken into God's house, and God had not stopped them. That question, why didn't he stop them, would haunt England for generations. The raiders, meanwhile, wasted no time. They weren't here to set up camp or hold territory. Their goal was speed. Hit fast, take everything, and vanish before the Northumbrian king even knew what happened. By the time soldiers on the mainland heard the news, the longships were already sliding back into the waves, loaded with loot captives. Imagine the silence afterward. The smoke drifting over charred beams, relics trampled into the mud, the cries of wounded monks echoing across the tidal flats. Lindisfarne, once the jewel of the north, lay in ruins. The survivors gathered in shock, some too dazed to even weep. The tide ebbed in and out as always, but the world had changed. For the Vikings, it was a triumph. They had proven the might of their ships, the ferocity of their men, and the riches waiting just across the sea. They would tell stories of Lindisfarne around firelit halls, boasting of treasures seized and monks silenced. For them, it wasn't sacrilege, it was just the first of many victories. The raid on Lindisfarne wasn't just a brutal morning in 793, it was a pivot in history. To the Anglo-Saxons, it felt like God's shield had been pierced. To the Norse, it was the beginning of an age of opportunity. And to later generations, it became a story told again and again. The moment when the Viking Age was born in fire, fear, and the crash of longships against English sand. News of Lindisfarne didn't stay on the island. It spread like smoke caught on the wind. Survivors stumbled back to the mainland, their robes torn, faces streaked with blood and ash, carrying stories that made listeners pale. The monastery had been destroyed, monks slaughtered, treasures taken, holy relics trampled in the mud. For the people of Northumbria, it was unthinkable. To them, it was as if heaven itself had been ransacked. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, basically England's medieval Twitter feed, recorded the horror in stark words. The ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne. No flowery language, no exaggeration, just a flat gut-punch statement. The writers wanted everyone to feel the dread. The world had changed overnight, and the new world smelled of smoke and salt. Beyond England, the shock echoed across Europe. Letters flew between scholars and churchmen. One of the loudest voices came from Alcuin of York, who was working in Charlemagne's court. Alcuin wrote with despair, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain, as we have now suffered from a pagan race." To him, the raid wasn't just an attack on Northumbria. It was an insult hurled at Christendom itself. The symbolism stung hardest. Lindisfarne wasn't just any monastery. It was the cradle of northern English Christianity, the place of saints, miracles and manuscripts. To see it desecrated by pagans felt like a cosmic joke. If God's own house could be violated, then where was God's protection? People began whispering whether this was divine punishment, for sins, for pride, for something yet unnamed. The church tried to make sense of it. Some leaders claimed it was a test, a trial of faith. Others argued it was punishment. Maybe the Northumbrian kings had shed too much blood, or the people had grown lazy in their devotion. Medieval folks didn't look at events like this as random. Everything had meaning. A storm wasn't just weather. A raid wasn't just men with swords. It was a message from heaven. And heaven, apparently, was furious. For ordinary people, the raid turned faith into fear. If holy men could be slaughtered, what hope was there for farmers and shepherds? Pilgrimages slowed, donations to monasteries dried up. The idea that monasteries were safe havens cracked wide open. Villagers who once trusted in monks' prayers now looked nervously out to sea, wondering if dragon ships lurked beyond the horizon. And in the courts of kings, the raid raised alarms. If an island monastery could be hit, then so could villages, towns, even royal halls. Rulers realised the North Sea was no longer a shield but a doorway. Armies on horseback were useless if the enemy slipped past them on water. The rules of warfare had changed. The Vikings had introduced a new playbook, and it was written in oars and sails. Meanwhile, across the sea, the Norse were celebrating. Songs were sung, horns of mead raised, stories of Lindisfarne told and retold in smoky halls. To them, it was proof that their ships and courage could make kings tremble. They didn't care about the symbolism. They cared about silver, slaves, and the thrill of victory. And with every retelling, the raid grew larger, more glorious, feeding the hunger for more. The shockwaves didn't stop in Northumbria. Across Europe, rulers heard the news and shivered. If Lindisfarne could fall, so could they. Monasteries in Ireland, Francia, and even the Mediterranean would soon learn the same lesson. Lindisfarne was the spark. The blaze that followed would sweep across the continent, carried by sails and sharpened steel. In the end, the raid on Lindisfarne was more than just one day of bloodshed. It was a message, echoing louder than the clash of swords. The world had changed. The sea was no longer a barrier, but a highway. Faith alone couldn't guarantee safety, and a new force, the Vikings, had announced themselves with fire and fury. The shockwaves of 793 would be felt for centuries. Not everyone on Lindisfarne died that day. A few monks survived, bruised, broken, but alive. They stumbled through the smoke and ashes, trying to make sense of what they had seen. Their world, built on prayer and ritual, had been ripped apart by men who worshipped other gods and answered only to the sea. To survive was its own kind of burden. The survivors had to carry the memory. Imagine the silence after the raiders left. The longships were gone, their sails shrinking against the horizon. In their wake lay broken doors, burned timbers and bodies. The survivors picked their way through the ruins, stepping over shattered chalices and scattered manuscripts. Every corner held grief, every stone whispered of prayers interrupted. For men used to a rhythm of bells and chants, the silence was deafening. Some survivors fled inland, carrying the story like a wound. They told villages and courts what had happened. Dragon ships, axes flashing, monks slain. Their words spread faster than armies could march. To ordinary villagers, these survivors seemed like ghostly messengers, proof that the nightmare was real. To kings, their words were a warning. The voices of the survivors show up in letters and chronicles. One wrote that blood was spilled on the altar of God. Another claimed that saints' relics were trampled. These accounts were meant to horrify, to ensure no one forgot. The trauma was too sharp to fade quietly. Writing it down was their way of making sense of it, and their way of shouting across time. And yet, even among the grief there was survival. Relics were saved. Some manuscripts were hidden and preserved. The monks who remained eventually rebuilt, stone by stone, hymn by hymn. That resilience mattered. If Lindisfarne had simply been abandoned, the story might have been different. But the survivors refused to let the memory die. Survivors also carried questions. Why had God allowed this? Why had saints like Cuthbert not defended their holy island? For men who believed heaven listened to every prayer, the silence of that day was a thunderclap. Some whispered that England had sinned, that this was punishment. Others believed it was a test. Either way, the questions weighed heavy. The emotional toll was immense. Survivors saw brothers slain before their eyes. They lost friends, mentors, students. And unlike soldiers who expected battle, monks were never trained for violence. Their memories weren't of duels or glory. They were of prayers interrupted by screams. Survivors carried not just scars but nightmares. Still they spoke. They told their stories to anyone who would listen, to villagers who asked, "What happened?" to scribes who recorded the chronicles, to future monks who would inherit Lindisfarne's ruins and its legend. Their voices became the thread tying the memory of the raid into history. Without them, the horror might have faded. With them, it became unforgettable. And in a way, those survivors gave the raid its power. They framed it not just as robbery, but as sacrilege. Not just as violence, but as apocalypse. Their words travelled across Christendom, shaping how the raid was remembered. Without their voices, Lindisfarne might have been just another coastal tragedy. With them, it became the opening chapter of the Viking Age. In the end, the survivors were more than just witnesses. They were storytellers. They took the horror of that summer day and turned it into history. They rebuilt, they wrote, they remembered. Their voices still reach us, echoing across 12 centuries, reminding us of fire, blood, and resilience on a small island off the coast of Northumbria. Out of all the coasts of Britain, out of all the villages and towns, why Lindisfarne? Why this one holy island in 793? The question has echoed for centuries. Historians scratched their heads, monks shook their heads, and the Vikings probably just nodded and said, because it was there. But the truth is, Lindisfarne wasn't random. It was the perfect storm of wealth, weakness, and messing. First, let's talk about wealth. Monasteries weren't banks, but they might as well have been. Over decades, kings and nobles donated gold, silver, relics, and land. Pilgrims left gifts. Lindisfarne's treasury was a glittering collection of sacred objects, all meant to glorify God, and unintentionally to tempt raiders. To a hungry Norse crew, chalices and jewelled crosses weren't sacred, they were just shiny. Second, weakness. Lindisfarne had no walls worth mentioning. Its fences kept sheep in, not warriors out. The monks believed prayer was protection enough, and for decades maybe it was, but to raiders with axes and longships, Lindisfarne was like a barn door left wide open. The tides that seemed like a shield, cutting the island off twice a day, were no match for shallow draft ships that could slip across like skates on ice. Then there was location. Lindisfarne sat right along the sailing routes the Vikings were beginning to explore. From Norway, the North Sea crossing dropped them neatly onto England's northeast coast. Easy sail, easy target. If you're a hungry raider with limited supplies, why sail farther when treasure is already within reach? But the biggest reason wasn't practical, it was symbolic. Lindisfarne wasn't just any monastery. It was famous. The place of St. Aidan, the shrine of St. Cuthbert, the island of the Lindisfarne Gospels. By attacking here, the raiders weren't just stealing silver, they were striking at the heart of English Christianity. Whether they knew it or not, they were making a statement, and the whole continent heard it. So was it chance? Did the Vikings roll up like tourists who stumbled onto something shiny? Or did they know exactly what they were doing? Some scholars argue it was deliberate, that Norse traders had already scouted the coast, gathering intel on rich monasteries. Others think it was more opportunistic, the Norse equivalent of, "Hey, look at that island, bet it's full of loot." Either way, Lindisfarne became their unlucky debut performance. From the Viking point of view, monasteries made sense. They were isolated, rich, and defended by prayer instead of soldiers. No walls, no spears, just men in robes. It's almost unfair, like raiding a bakery where the bakers don't fight back. And once the Norse figured this out, monasteries across Ireland, Scotland and England would soon learn the same painful lesson. But Lindisfarne also had spiritual weight the Vikings couldn't have missed. The Norse might not have cared about Christianity, but they knew power when they saw it. Pilgrims crossing seas, nobles sending gifts, the island shone with importance. To smash it was to send a message. Your gods are weak, your treasures are ours. Your holy places are nothing to us. That message thundered louder than any war horn. In hindsight, Lindisfarne was the perfect storm. Wealthy but undefended, famous but exposed, holy but fragile. To the monks it was heaven on earth. To the Vikings it was low-hanging fruit. And so in 793, the Jewel of the North became the first great prize of the Viking Age. So why Lindisfarne? Because it had everything the Vikings wanted, and nothing to stop them. The raid wasn't random, it was inevitable. The jewel was too bright, the island hens too vulnerable, and the raiders too hungry. Lindisfarne was the beginning not because it was unlucky, but because it was perfect. Perfect for treasure, perfect for terror, perfect for making history. History books often say the Viking Age began on June the 8th, 793, the day Lindisfarne fell. That's neat and tidy, like putting a bookmark in time. Of course, reality is messier. The Norse had been trading and raiding before that, but Lindisfarne was different. It wasn't just a raid, it was a signal. After that day, Europe realised a new age had arrived, carried on the sails of dragon ships. The years after 793 were like dominoes falling. More raids along the English coast. Monasteries hit in Ireland and Scotland. By the early 800s, the Norse were spreading out like ripples across a pond. Each raid taught them more, where the treasures were, how the tides worked, which kingdom reacted slowly. Every successful strike made the next one bolder, and soon raiding turned into something bigger, settling. At first the Norse came, looted and left, but after a while they looked around at the green fields of Britain and thought, why not some more stay? Land in Scandinavia was rocky and scarce. Here it was fertile and wide. So longships didn't just carry warriors anymore, they carried families, livestock and tools. Ireland was one of the first places to see this shift. What began as raids turned into permanent bases. The Norse founded Dublin, which grew from a Viking camp into a bustling town. Similar Tuskula stories played out in Waterford, Cork and Limerick. The Irish might not have liked their new neighbours, but they couldn't deny the Norse were changing the landscape. In England too the raid snowballed. The Northumbrian coast continued to suffer, but soon Mercia and Wessex felt the bite as well. By the mid-800s, the so-called Great Heathen Army landed, not a handful of raiders, but a full-scale invasion force. What started as hit-and-run attacks was now turning into a fight for kingdoms. The Frankish Empire wasn't spared either. Viking ships rowed up the Seine and the Loire, striking at towns deep inland. Paris itself was besieged in 845. Imagine standing on the city walls and seeing dragon ships gliding up the river, sails catching the wind. To the Franks, it was like invaders had appeared straight out of nowhere, except they came bearing axes instead of magic. And the Norse didn't stop with Britain and Francia. They reached Spain, raided in Italy, and even struck into North Africa. Their ships carried them farther than anyone expected. To Europe, it felt like the sea had turned hostile. No coast, no river, no city was truly safe anymore. The Viking Age wasn't just about raids. It was about the collapse of the old sense of security. But while fear spread, so did fascination. Norse traders brought exotic goods, furs, amber and slaves to markets. They mingled with Anglo-Saxons, Franks and Slavs. In time, they didn't just take, they blended. Their language, customs and ideas seeped into the cultures they touched. The Viking Age was an age of collision, but also of fusion. So yes, the Viking Age was born in terror at Lindisfarne, but it grew into much more. It became an age of raids, settlements, kingdoms, and cultural exchange. For 2 centuries, dragon ships shaped Europe's destiny, and it all began with the smoke rising from one monastery in 793. The birth of the Viking Age wasn't a single event. It was a wave. Lindisfarne was just the first crash of surf on the shore, a warning rumble of thunder before the storm. The monks who survived may not have known it, but they had lived through the opening act of one of history's great dramas. From here, the Viking Age would roar, reshape Europe, and echo for centuries. After the ashes cooled and the shock faded, the monks of Lindisfarne faced a choice: give up or rebuild. Walking through the ruins must have felt like wandering through a nightmare. Charred beams, blood-stained stones, relics smashed. And yet, for men of faith, despair wasn't the final word. Slowly, painfully, the monastic community began to pick up the pieces. They salvaged what they could. Manuscripts were dried and cleaned, relics rewrapped in cloth, altars rebuilt from scorched stone. Prayer resumed, even if the voices trembled at first. It was less about moving forward and more about surviving one day at a time. To copy scripture again after seeing brothers slain was an act of quiet defiance. To chant psalms in the ruined chapel was to say faith still stands. But the raid also shook their worldview. Monks asked hard questions. Why hadn't St. Cuthbert, the island's beloved saint, protected them? Had God abandoned his faithful? Was the raid punishment for sins? In an age where nothing was random, these were heavy questions. Some answered with humility. Maybe God was testing them. Others whispered about divine anger. Either way, the raid forced them to wrestle with faith in the face of terror. The church, of course, had its own spin. Leaders on the mainland called for stronger devotion, stricter prayer, and more donations. If pagans could strike, surely Christians needed to double down. Some bishops thundered that the people's sins had invited the disaster. Others urged compassion for survivors and rallied support for rebuilding. Either way, Lindisfarne became a cautionary tale told in pulpits across Britain. And rebuild they did. Stone by stone, hymn by hymn, the monastery rose again. Pilgrims returned, drawn by tales of survival and martyrdom. In fact, the raid made Lindisfarne more famous than ever. Before, it had been a holy island. After, it was a symbol of endurance, a place that had faced the storm and lived. People flocked to touch its relics, convinced that faith stronger than fire lingered there. The monks also carried St. Cuthbert's legacy farther inland. His relics were taken on long journeys across Northumbria when raids grew too frequent. Wherever they went, miracles were said to follow. In time, his body would rest at Durham Cathedral, turning that site into one of the greatest holy centres of medieval England. Lindisfarne may have burned, but its spirit travelled, shaping new foundations of faith. For other monasteries, the message was clear: prayer wasn't enough. Some fortified their walls, others moved treasures inland, away from the coast. Copying manuscripts became not just an act of devotion, but a race against loss. Every book finished was one more that might survive the next raid. Fear mixed with determination. The monasteries adapted because they had to. Still, not all responses were practical, some were spiritual. Chroniclers frame the raid as apocalypse, fiery dragons in the sky, divine wrath falling on sinners. For centuries afterward, preachers used Lindisfarne as proof that the faithful must stay vigilant. The raid became both a wound and a sermon, repeated generation after generation. And here's the irony. The Viking raid that tried to crush Lindisfarne ended up preserving its memory forever. Without the survivors' voices and the rebuilding efforts, Lindisfarne might have faded into obscurity like so many other holy sites. Instead, the raid gave it legend. The monastic response to their resilience, their writing, their devotion, turned tragedy into legacy. So the monks of Lindisfarne answered violence with faith. They rebuilt, they remembered, and that they carried their story into the future. The raid didn't silence them. If anything, it made their voices louder. And because of that, 12 centuries later, we still tell their story. The ashes of 793 became the foundation stones of history. Lindisfarne wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Once the Norse realised how easy it was to strike, the floodgates opened. Raids spread across the British Isles like fire leaping from house to house. At first, it was small fleets, just enough men to sack a monastery or terrorise a coastal village. But soon the raids grew bigger, bolder and more organised. The dragon ships no longer came once in a lifetime. They came every summer. Ireland became one of their favourite playgrounds. Monasteries there, just like Lindisfarne, were wealthy and poorly defended. But instead of just raiding and running, the Norse started building bases. Dublin, today Ireland's capital, was originally a Viking town, a hub for trade, raiding, and yes, a busy slave market. From there, the Norse spread across the island, weaving themselves into Ireland's history in ways that can still be felt today. England too felt the full weight of the longships. By the mid-800s, the raids turned into invasions. The so-called Great Heathen Army wasn't a handful of ships, but thousands of warriors landing to carve out territory. They swept across Northumbria, Mercia and East Anglia, leaving Wessex as the last kingdom standing. Alfred the Great would earn his name fighting these invaders, holding back the tide where others had fallen. Out of these conquests came the Danelaw, the area of England under Viking control. Towns like York, which the Norse called Jorvik, flourished under Viking rule. Markets bustled, silver coins stamped with Norse design spread across the land, and cultures began to mix. Even today, English place names ending in by or thorp trace back to Viking settlers. The raiders didn't just plunder, they planted roots. Across the Channel, Francia faced its own nightmare. Viking fleets rode up the Seine, the Loire and other rivers, striking deep inland. Paris itself was besieged more than once. To stop the raids, Frankish kings sometimes resorted to paying the invaders off with huge sums of silver. Imagine explaining that in court. Yes, sire, we paid the men who burned our towns, so they wouldn't burn more. Spoiler, they usually came back anyway, but expansion wasn't only about raiding. The Norse were explorers too. They sailed west to settle Iceland, then pushed farther to Greenland. And around the year 1000, Leif Erikson reached North America, landing in a place the sagas call Vinland. Nearly 500 years before Columbus, the Norse had already set foot on the New World. Southward, some Vikings became mercenaries. In Constantinople, Norse warriors Lulitia served in the Byzantine Emperor's elite guard, the Varangian Guard. These axe-wielding northerners became famous for their loyalty and ferocity, carving out a reputation far from the fjords of home. From monasteries in England to palaces in Byzantium, the Norse left footprints everywhere. The legacy of all this expansion was complicated. On one hand, the raids brought fear, destruction and loss. Monasteries burned, towns were sacked and thousands were enslaved. But on the other hand, the Norse also built cities, opened trade routes and blended cultures. They weren't just destroyers, they were reshapers. Europe came out of the Viking Age bruised, but also transformed. Even language carries their mark. Words like sky, egg, knife and husband all trace back to Old Norse. If you have ever yelled, "Are we there yet?" on a long trip, oh well, you can thank Viking settlers for sprinkling their vocabulary into English. The raids faded, but the words stayed, hiding in plain sight in everyday speech. So what was the legacy of the Vikings? Terror, yes. Fire and blood, certainly. But also trade, settlement, exploration and cultural fusion. They reshaped Europe in ways no one could ignore. From Dublin to York, from Paris to Constantinople, their impact still lingers. Lindisfarne was only the spark. The legacy was a fire that spread across continents, leaving behind scars and stories. The raid on Lindisfarne didn't end when the Vikings sailed away. The memory of that day lingered, whispered in monasteries, preached in churches, and scribbled into chronicles. It wasn't just an event, it was a story, retold so many times it grew into legend. For the Anglo-Saxons, Lindisfarne became a scar that never quite healed, a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it bluntly, but later retellings added colour and drama. Chroniclers described fiery dragons in the sky, whirlwinds and omens before the raid. Were they real? Probably not, but the monks needed to make sense of the horror, so they framed it as a cosmic warning. To them, the heavens themselves had screamed out, "Something terrible is coming." Over time, Lindisfarne became a symbol, not just of destruction, but of divine lessons. Preachers used it in sermons. See what happens when people grow sinful, or when kings neglect God's will. The raid was reshaped into a moral tale. Monks who weren't even alive in 793 wrote about it centuries later, treating it like a warning bell that kept ringing across generations. But memory isn't just about fear. Lindisfarne also became a story of resilience. The monastery was rebuilt, faith endured, and pilgrims still came. Over time, the legend of St. Cuthbert grew even stronger. People believed his spirit had guided the survivors and blessed the island despite the bloodshed. In a strange way, the violence gave Lindisfarne more fame than ever before. Later generations even mythologized the Vikings themselves. In medieval texts, they were cast as God's scourge, fierce instruments of divine punishment. They weren't just men, they were almost like apocalyptic beasts sent to test the faithful. In artwork, They sometimes appeared more monstrous than human, their ships like floating dragons. The memory of Lindisfarne helped forge the Viking image we still carry today, and that image survived. Centuries later, when people in England and beyond thought of Vikings, they thought of Lindisfarne. Not peaceful traders or settlers, but raiders with axes, storming holy places. The reality was more complicated, of course, but memories have a way of simplifying things. Lindisfarne locked the Vikings into the role of invaders in Europe's imagination. Even in modern times, Lindisfarne's raid still looms large. Historians call it the beginning of the Viking Age. Writers retell it in books, documentaries and lectures. Tourists visit the island today, walking through its quiet ruins, trying to picture that morning in 793 when dragon ships broke the horizon. The place may be calm now, but memory clings to the stones. The long memory of Lindisfarne is also a lesson in how stories shape history. Was it truly the first Viking raid? Maybe not, but it was the one people remembered, the one that carried symbolic weight. Memory doesn't always care about accuracy, it cares about meaning. Lindisfarne became the shorthand for a whole era, the spark that lit the fire in the collective mind of Europe. That's the power of memory. It stretches far beyond the event itself. For centuries, parents warned their children, kings warned their subjects, and monks warned their flocks. Remember Lindisfarne. It wasn't just history. It was a story of warning, resilience, and the fragility of peace. And once told, it was never forgotten. So Lindisfarne lives on, not only in stone ruins and manuscripts, but in memory itself. The raid became a legend, shaping how we picture Vikings, how we imagine monasteries, and how we understand the fragility of the past. 12 centuries later, the long memory of Lindisfarne still whispers through history, a reminder of the day peace cracked and a new age began. When we step back from Lindisfarne, the raid isn't just about Vikings and monks, it's about fragility. A quiet island filled with prayer and devotion thought itself untouchable. And then, one summer morning, dragon ships appeared, and everything changed. Lindisfarne shows us how quickly the world can shift, how peace can be cracked open in a single day. The monks believed their faith would shield them. For decades it did. But when men with swords arrived, faith alone could not stop blades. That's not a knock against belief. It's a reminder of human vulnerability. Even the strongest walls or the holiest prayers can be broken. Lindisfarne teaches us that safety is often more fragile than we want to admit. But fragility isn't the whole story. There's also power. Not the kind held in axes or armies, but the quiet power of memory. The Vikings burned the monastery, but the monks rebuilt it. They wrote down their grief. They passed on the story. 12 centuries later, we're still telling it. That's power the raiders never imagined, the endurance of words. There's also the power of transformation. Lindisfarne was supposed to be a place of prayer. After the raid, it became a symbol. It marked the beginning of the Viking Age, a turning point in European history. Out of the ashes of a small monastery rose an entire chapter of the human story. Fragility gave way to legacy. And isn't that how history often works? One quiet corner of the world suddenly thrust into the spotlight. One small place, shaping centuries that follow. Lindisfarne reminds us that history isn't always made in castles or capitals. Sometimes it's made on a windy little island, where monks chant prayers and raiders land their ships. The raid also forces us to ask big questions. How do we measure strength? Is it in armies and weapons, or in culture and memory? The Vikings won the day at Lindisfarne, but the monks, in their way, won the centuries. Their voices survived, their books survived, the story survived. Strength comes in many forms, and sometimes the quietest one endures the longest. Lindisfarne also shows the power of symbols. For the Vikings, it was just one raid. For the world, it became the symbol of an age. One monastery stood for the vulnerability of a whole continent. One attack became shorthand for centuries of raids. That's how stories work. They turn moments into meaning. And maybe the most haunting reflection is this. History repeats. Every age has its Lindisfarne, moments when peace shatters, when the unthinkable suddenly happens. But every age also has its survivors, the ones who rebuild, who write, who carry the memory forward. Lindisfarne is about loss, yes, but it's also about endurance. So what's the legacy of Lindisfarne? Fragility and power. The fragility of peace. The power of memory. A raid meant to erase became a story that lasted longer than the raiders themselves. It reminds us that history isn't just swords and kings, it's also voices, echoes, and lessons carried across centuries. And that's why we still talk about it today. The monks are gone, the raiders are gone, but the story remains. Lindisfarne whispers across time, reminding us that peace is precious, that memory is powerful, and that even the smallest island can change the course of history.